death is something that we all think about. And while a lot of us hope that we get a peaceful death at the end of our lives, where we feel happy and satisfied with the life that we lived, a lot of us do not get that luxury. Unfortunately, a lot of people die in a way that is incredibly gruesome, or just in a way that cannot be explained or solved. Now let's take the case of spontaneous human combustion, for example. There are a lot of cases where people burn alive, but the fire seems to come from the inside, and people don't know what exactly causes these fires. Probably the most famous example of spontaneous human combustion is the case of Mary Reeser from St. Petersburg. On July 1st, 1951, Miss Mary Reeser was sitting around with her son enjoying a nice meal. After catching up for a few hours, her son decided to leave and gave her a kiss on the way out. Being pretty late in the night, Mary knew she had a sleeping problem, so she took 2 sleeping pills, sat back in her chair, and lit up a cigarette. But unfortunately, that was the last time Mary was ever seen alive. Now, at around 8 a.m. the next morning, Mrs. Reese's landlord, Pansy Carpenter, actually got a telegram for her, so she decided to go and deliver it. Upon coming to Mary's door, she actually felt the doorknob was extremely hot, and she couldn't really keep her hand on it for too long. Worried about a possible fire inside the apartment, Mrs. Carpenter decided to call the cops and let them investigate. When paramedics got there, they actually found out that the house did burn somewhat, but not entirely. It seemed to burn in a strange fashion that they could not really explain. The crazy thing is that Miss Mary was actually missing. Well, not exactly missing. It seemed that where she sat was a pile of ashes. And next to these ashes was actually Miss Mary's left foot, with the slippers still on it. Along with Mary's left foot was also her skull, which just happened to be shrunken. In most burning cases, people do not have their skulls shrunken, but this is something that happens a lot in spontaneous human combustion cases. Several plastic things around Miss Mary were melted a bit, but not really damaged. There was some smoke that happened to stain the walls, but even her bedsheets were completely white, and most of the other apartment was unscathed. So law enforcement really wondered how exactly her body can be almost completely cremated while the rest of the apartment did not have any visible signs, or had very little evidence of a fire. Now, law enforcement doesn't really know what happened to her. There are some crazy theories like her getting struck by lightning, or even her falling asleep and having the cigarette lighter on fire, but that does not explain her surroundings and how everything else was almost perfectly intact. To this day, there are a few other cases of spontaneous human combustion, and law enforcement is scratching their heads at what exactly can cause this phenomenon. Now, our next story is the story of Sir William Herbert Wallace, who lived in a country northwest of England called Cumberland. Now, this story is going to start off in 1914, where Mr. Wallace was actually an election agent, which meant that he actually took control of people's campaigns and he helped people pretty much run for office. Now, during his time as an election agent, he actually met his wife, Julia Dennis, and they got married in 1914. When World War I began, however, he lost his job since his position was discontinued, and he actually decided to lecture. So he got a position in Liverpool Technical College and taught there during the week. Now, Mr. Wallace was actually in charge of the chess club, and one day when showing up to practice, he actually showed up to find out that he had a message that was given by telephone. Now, the message came from an R.M. Quattro, and apparently he had important matters to discuss with Mr. Wallace. The message asked for Mr. Wallace to meet him at Marlowe's Garden East in Liverpool at around 7:30 the next day. Now, in fear that he might be missing something, or that he might be missing out on an important business deal, Mr. Wallace made his way to that location the very next day. Once he arrived around that central location, he was looking for Marlowe's Garden East. He found the north, west, and south, but he could not find the east in particular. After searching for about an hour, Mr. Wallace decided to ask nearby people if they could point him in the direction of Marlowe's Garden East, and they told him that that didn't exist. Now, being frustrated for having to travel all that way for nothing, Mr. Wallace notified the law enforcement that he got a faulty message and decided to head back home for the night. Upon arriving at his house, he found out that it was actually locked and he couldn't get in from the back and the front. He tried the back one more time and it did not open, so he decided to go and try the front again while his neighbors watched, wondering what's going on. This time, for some reason, it actually did open, but inside he found that his wife had been brutally beaten to death. Now, being absolutely shocked, Mr. Wallace notified the police, and of course he was the first suspect. According to police, the original message, which was Mr. Quattro that called the chess club, actually came 400 yards from Mr. Wallace's home from a payphone. Now, law enforcement actually believed that it was Mr. Wallace, and they believed that he actually had time to pretty much kill his wife and then go on this fake scavenger hunt for this Mr. Quattro to avoid suspicion. They even asked the guy who took the original message, and he said that there was no way the person on the other line could be Mr. Wallace since he knew his voice very well. Investigation on the clothes that Mr. Wallace wore that day also showed that there was no signs of blood on him. There was, however, a large garment found under Mr. Julia's body, which could have been used to shield himself from the blood. However, after further inspections of the house, they found out that none of the drains had recently had blood go down them, so it was very unlikely that anything was cleaned and that Mr. Wallace was actually the one who did the murder. The trial tried really hard to make Mr. Wallace look guilty, but of course they could not find enough evidence to prosecute him, and he was let go. And while he managed to keep his job, his reputation around the city was forever ruined, and people actually thought that he was guilty, but that he got away with it scot-free. Now, to this day, there is not enough evidence to prove that Mr. Wallace was the one who killed his wife, but there is also no evidence saying that it was anybody else, so the mystery is still unsolved, and maybe one day we can find out what exactly happened to Miss Julia Dennis. Now, the next story is actually very tragic and is probably one of the biggest mysteries, crime related at least, that America has ever seen, and that is the story of Brian Wells. Now, I am going to be going into detail on this case, but just know that there is a lot more detail that I'm going to cover. This is just too big of a crime for me to cover in one video, especially when the whole video is not directly for this one case. So just keep that in mind, and let us continue with the story. Our story starts off on August 28, 2003 in Erie, Pennsylvania, with a middle-aged man called Brian Wells entering a PNC bank. He went up to the teller and gave her a note which pretty much said to get all the employees with access to the vault and to fill up the bag he's about to give her with $250,000. It also said that they only had 15 minutes to do so. While he said this, he lifted up his shirt to show the teller a bomb in the shape of a collar around his neck. The panicked teller told him that was not enough time to fill up the bag with that much money and put $8,000 in the bag and gave it to Mr. Wells. Mr. Wells looked in the bag, grabbed the lollipop from the counter, and walked out of the bank. He got in his car and drove for about 15 minutes before law enforcement was able to catch up to him. When police caught up to him, they tried to hold him down, and Mr. Wells said that earlier that day he had a pizza delivery that led him to an old transmitter site on a dirt road. According to Mr. Wells, once he got to this spot, a group of black men tied a collar bomb around his neck and told him to go rob a bank. The cops, who didn't realize he had a bomb around his neck, backed up and watched Mr. Wells from a distance for about 25 minutes. Now, the bomb used in the killing was actually very strange. It consisted of a hinge collar that kind of worked like a handcuff. It went around the neck. It had 4 keyholes that went under the chin and a rectangular section that contained 2 pipe bombs and 2 kitchen liners. 1 electronic timer hung over the chest. The device also had several decoys like unconnected wires, a toy cell phone that were pretty much just there to distract people that were trying to disarm the bomb itself. So law enforcement called the bomb squad and they decided to go on their way. Mr. Wells did make it a point, however, to tell the police officers to call his employer to make sure that he knew that he wasn't pretty much trying to escape his job. After about 25 minutes of waiting for the bomb squad to arrive, the collar bomb started beeping rapidly. Mr. Wells did not know what to do, so he started backing up slowly when the bomb went off and killed Mr. Wells almost instantly. The police took cover and eventually walked up to Mr. Wells' body after the initial explosion, and they saw that he had a cane with him. After further inspection, the cane was actually a homemade gun of some sort. Now, what's even stranger is that after they searched Mr. Wells' car, they actually found a note inside of it. The note was addressed to bomb hostage, and it pretty much told Mr. Wells to go rob a bank for that amount of money, and that after the crime was committed, he were to go around finding certain clues around Erie that would eventually lead him to all the keys needed to remove the collar from his neck. And what's even weirder is that the cops decided to follow the route that Mr. Wells had to take in order to find the keys. They found an orange box that had a note leading to another location, which is said to have a jar with a note inside of it that would lead to even then another location. Once the cops got to that jar, they found that it was empty. So law enforcement suspects that the person who laid down all these clues knew that the cops were following the path, and they actually went to pretty much collect all these clues back, which means that the perpetrators involved were most likely really close to the cops during the entire investigation, and maybe even keeping track of them to make sure that they stayed off course. Now, this story has a lot of possible theories behind it. Some people think that Mr. Wells was actually a conspirator and he was in on this, but the bomb malfunctioned, or that he did not know that the bomb could actually go off. Of course, his pizza delivery to the transmitter location is a big clue and could obviously lead to pretty much the mystery being solved, but what is even weirder is that his family states that that never even happened. So not only is the initial death of Mr. Wells a mystery, but also the events that led up to it. When police went to go investigate the transmission tower area, they actually noticed some footprints on the dirt road that matched Mr. Wells. What they also noticed was a heavy-set man pacing outside of his house right next to the tower itself. The house was so close, in fact, that the backyard almost touched the tower itself, and the man identified himself as Bill Rothstein. Now, Bill Rothstein was described as a very well-educated man who spoke very elegantly and actually knew a good amount of French. Now, police interviewed him and they asked him if he maybe saw anything in his backyard or any suspicious activity around the tower that might help solve the mystery, but he said that he saw nothing and that he did not even notice that there was an investigation going on. After being interviewed for a little while, the law enforcement decided that he was not very interesting to the case and that he probably didn't know anything, so they took off. Now, everything changed about a month later when Mr. Rothstein actually made a call to authorities. And now Mr. Rothstein said that in his freezer in his own home there was a body. That same day, Mr. Rothstein was in jail, and he said that he was suicidal for the last few weeks, and they even found a suicide note on his desk. The note stated that the man in the freezer was Jim Rhoden and that he had nothing to do with the killing itself, and it also suspiciously stated that it had nothing to do with the Wells case. Mr. Rothstein said that the body was in the freezer because his ex-girlfriend called him saying that she had killed Mr. Rhoden over money disputes. His ex-girlfriend was identified as Marjorie Deal Armstrong. According to Mr. Rothstein, he did not want to be a bad person and decided to help her by hiding his body in his freezer. He then got the gun that was used to kill Mr. Rhoden and melted it until it got to little bits and pieces, and he scattered them around Erie. He was also planning on grinding up the body but decided he could not go through with it, and he called 911 because he was afraid of what his ex-girlfriend might do. Ms. Armstrong was later arrested for the murder, but she decided to spill the beans and said that Mr. Rothstein had actually lied on the note and that Mr. Rhoden's death was actually very much involved with the Wells case. Now, Ms. Armstrong had a crazy past because she actually had a husband who died of a hemorrhage, but when he got to the hospital, there was actually signs that he had head trauma, but this was never investigated further. People who knew her when she was younger also stated that she was incredibly intelligent, that she actually was very good at almost all subjects, but that eventually she started going mad and she started getting paranoid with a severe bipolar disorder. Now, this might seem like she is crazy, which she probably was, but this is also the type of person needed to commit a crime like what happened to Mr. Wells. Law enforcement also noticed that she had a very big ego because she knew how intelligent she actually was. They believed that if she was a part of the Wells case, which was very ingenious and intelligent, that it would be very hard for her to fight off the urge to brag about it. Now, according to Mrs. Armstrong, who was already given 20 years for the murder of Mr. Rhoden, she was not an active participant in the bomb heist, but she did supply some things needed for the bomb itself. In a strange twist, she also claimed that Mr. Wells was actually in on the heist and that Mr. Rothstein was masterminding the whole thing. After being interviewed for hours and hours, law enforcement started to think that she was actually the mastermind behind the plot, however. She seemed to know the entire bomb heist by incredible detail, and law enforcement actually thought that she actually killed Mr. Rhoden because she thought that he was going to spill the beans about the entire heist. Now, a few weeks later, after the interviews with Mrs. Armstrong, there was actually a man that came forward and pretty much ratted out a person with the name of Kenneth Barnes. Now, the witness that came forward and ratted out Mr. Barnes was actually his brother-in-law, and according to him, Mr. Barnes talked a little bit too freely about the planned heist, and he overheard him and decided to turn him in. Now, in order to avoid more jail time, Mr. Barnes decided to cooperate, and he said that Miss Armstrong was actually the mastermind behind the entire plan. Mr. Barnes said that the reason she needed all this money was because she wanted her father dead, and she wanted Mr. Barnes to do it, but before she could get him to do it, she had to pay him this large amount of money for the crime. For some reason, Miss Armstrong even decided to cooperate with police even further, and had them drive her around Erie, where she pointed out several locations where she was around the day of the crime, and all these locations were linked to the crime itself. Now, at the end of the day, law enforcement came to the conclusion that Miss Armstrong was actually the mastermind. Mr. Rothstein was also involved, Mr. Barnes was also involved, but so was Mr. Wells. Now, when it came to trial, Mr. Barnes was given 45 years, but he did decide to testify against Mrs. Armstrong in hopes of getting his sentence reduced. According to Mr. Barnes, Ms. Armstrong was a mastermind and Mr. Rothstein was also involved, but he said that Mr. Wells was also involved, but that he knew that the bomb was going to be fake. According to Mr. Barnes, the bomb was never supposed to be real, and the scavenger hunt was just a distraction for the cops. Apparently, Mr. Wells was supposed to rob the bank and take the money and escape without luring the cops' attention. If Mr. Wells was to get caught, however, he can just give the cops the unclear instructions of the scavenger hunt, which will eventually lead to nothing, and Mr. Wells would be free to go. Now, according to Mr. Barnes, Mr. Wells was promised a payday, and since he was going out with a prostitute who was addicted to drugs, he could use the money to buy that for her and keep her happy. Now, Mr. Wells was in on the plan the entire time, according to Barnes, and that apparently he knew that the bomb was not going to blow up on him. Whenever they ordered Mr. Wells to go to the transmitter to deliver those pizzas, however, according to Mr. Barnes, that's when Mr. Wells found out that he was being double-crossed because they tied him down and they put the actual bomb on him. Now, according to Mr. Barnes, this bomb was not a dud like Mr. Wells thought, and the bomb was actually going to blow up if he didn't commit and do exactly what he needed to do. Now, according to Mrs. Armstrong's testimony, she did not know Mr. Wells at all, and he never met him, even the day of the bomb heist, which of course the jury did not buy, and they were all sentenced. Mr. Armstrong was sentenced to life, and Mr. Barnes actually served his 45 years. Now, while the whole mystery seems to be solved, there is an agent who works for the FBI who's a criminal investigator called Jim Fisher, who believes that Rothstein was actually the mastermind behind the whole thing and not Mrs. Armstrong. According to Mr. Fisher, he believes that Mr. Rothstein was the type of person to create a bomb and that he just did it in order to create a puzzle, and it was never for money or it was never for anything else. According to Jim Fisher, he believed that Mr. Rothstein just wanted to prove how intelligent he was and create something out of amusement rather than out of monetary gain. But of course, we don't know exactly what happened in this mystery. While those people were charged, there is a lot of wishy-washy topics in this crime that may or may not be true depending on the person that is telling you. Anyways guys, I know this is a death video and it can't really get any lighter for this type of subject, but I do want to end the case on some smaller little deaths that have happened, and by smaller I mean with not a lot of information behind them. They're just kind of random bizarre deaths that you might find interesting. In 2001, a man named Bernd Barnes, who was a German engineer from Berlin, willingly got slaughtered by somebody so that he can be eaten. Now, the man who killed and ate him was Armin Mewis, who had put up an advertisement on the internet to look for someone who was willing to die, that way this man could eat human flesh. Mewis went to jail, and apparently in jail he became a vegetarian. In 2004, a man named Philip Quinn, who was 24 in Kent, Washington, was killed by a lava lamp that he was heating on his stove for some reason. Apparently the man wanted to heat up the lava lamp on his stove, and eventually it blew up, broke into shards, and one of them pierced his heart, causing him to die almost instantly. Apparently in 2009, a man named Larry Eli Murillo Moncado fell inside a gap in a grocery store where he worked behind a shelf. Now, the man was 25 years old and went missing in 2009, but his body was not found until 10 years later in 2019, when they moved the shelf and found his body behind it, very much decomposed. And last but not least, in 2012, a man named Edward Archaboyd died by choking on a cockroach in a cockroach eating contest. And that is all for this topic. I thank you all for joining me. This has been Sinister Stories. Now, I know I haven't uploaded in a few months, and I'm sorry about that, guys. I have a lot of stuff going on, especially with college and work and all that. It is hard to make videos, especially when I don't have a lot of time, so I hope you all can understand that. Now, as y'all may know, YouTube is a big passion for me. I love doing it whenever I do have free time, but it is kind of hard to make content whenever I do get busy, and that does happen quite often. So if y'all would like to support me, I will leave the link down below. If y'all want to make donations, you can. Of course, you don't have to. None of you have to. Your views are more than enough support for the channel. I just want you to know that whatever support you do decide to give, if you do give it, will help me make videos a little bit faster and will also provide me some financial security just in case I do want to take some time off and just make videos for a while. And I know a lot of you guys are new to the channel from previous videos. A lot of you have subscribed within the past few months, and I thank you all for your support. I hope that you all can enjoy the channel as much as you can, and I do hope that you guys share the channel with all of your friends or all of those who are into this type of topic that you may know. Anyways guys, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Have fun, make sure to wash your hands, and make sure that you all stay safe. Take your precautions that may be necessary for this time, especially with this virus going around. It's better to be safe than sorry, and I know you all are going to be doing your best to stay safe from that. This has been Sinister Stories, and until the next time guys, make sure to drop a comment, make sure to leave a like, let me know in the bottom if you have any topics you want me to talk about, and I will see you all in the next one guys. Take it easy.